Good afternoon, good night for you, Joshua, or good morning. And we're back with quite an interesting session. I didn't advertise, this topic, but this is a major project that we're developing. And tonight around the screen, we have some top experts. One legal expert, Vashko, one biorefinery expert, Theo, one environmental expert, Amber, one key young generation forethinker, Joshua, and one very good analyst, Nicholas. So without notice, I'm going to give the floor to Vashko, who will explain the international legal context of oil rig decommissioning and why are we looking at oil rig decommissioning to grow seaweed. So Vashko, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Good evening from Lisbon, and I hope everyone is doing well and still stamina keep going. Thank you very much, Pierre. The issue is quite complex in terms of legal background, and we have to always start from a larger perspective. And the fact is that the ocean is getting busier. There are more activities at sea, there are more uses at sea, and we see that there are a quite considerable amount of offshore installations and cables and other infrastructures at sea that raise significant concerns, not only in maintaining them and keeping safety zones around them, but also making sure that they are useful while using other activities such as fishing, for example, or navigation. And above all, we always have to have concern for the protection and preservation of the marine environment. This demands that we have tools at sea that are useful for the proper management of the maritime space, adopting always and first and foremost an ecosystem-based approach, but of course take into consideration that there are competing uses at sea, and there will be more and more as we see the potential of developing a sustainable blue economy. From the international legal perspective, the topic that brings us together to this evening is not one that's easily attainable, in the sense that we do not have an international legal regime specifically addressing the issue of decommissioning or repurposing offshore installations. We have a larger overarching normative framework, that is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, that does not include a mandatory obligation of removal or decommissioning. It's very much left for states to adopt that decision from a domestic legal point of view. Having said this, we do have international guidelines and standards under the International Maritime Organization and also under UNEP, for example. And then we have other regional approaches, and first and foremost and relevant to us in Northeast Atlantic Ocean is OSPAR, and a decision that has been taken some time ago and since has been a sort of paradigm for other regions in the world. Having said this, many states still do not have legislation specifically addressing decommissioning, repurposing a offshore installation. We do have measures that are adopted for avoiding dumping, illegal dumping at sea, mostly focused on protection and preservation of the marine environment. But what we should also see is not the glass half full, but half empty. We do see that there are tools available on international law that will allow us to legally, sustainably, and environmentally friendly repurpose offshore installations. And it's good also to understand that this is a topic that can be very much hijacked from a non-legal point of view. And there is a very peculiar case from some time ago where an offshore installation was considered being repurposed or reused, and there was conflicts in terms of what should be the right approach to this. And today we have the technology and we have the legal tools that allow us to make a more fundamented decision. And in that case, I would say that in Northeast Atlantic, we see a trend by many coastal states to adopt, for example, marine special planning and having legislation on environmental impact assessments And all those tools and frameworks help us to make more accurate and more sustainable decisions in terms of repurposing. And repurposing is a good viable solution when you have so many offshore installations that are either reaching the end of their lifetime or removing can be extremely costly and might not be the most environmentally friendly approach. And therefore, and I will just conclude with one note, that having gone through some in a very superficial way on some of the details that international legal details that regard the overall purpose of this panel, I would say that when looking into the different frameworks, we always have to start from the international into the regional and then into the national level. And there is a lot of work that can be done from a national perspective in terms of improving legal frameworks and making sure that we have coherent and feasible legal solutions to safeguard all the many different interests at hand that ultimately make the most of these existing infrastructures and that can very well have a second life. Thank you. Back to you, Pierre.
Thank you, Vasco, for this thorough introduction. So we understand that it's not a simple case. So I'm going to turn to Nicolas. Nicolas, you've just finished a global review on the oil rig decommissioning market. Could you, in a nutshell, tell us how big this is and what are the many options that could be envisaged?
Yes, so the decommissioning industry, as it's called, is it doesn't actually have a very strict definition. So sometimes it's referred to as the complete removal of platforms, but as Vasco indicated, the legal framework is in a gray area. So it can refer either to the complete or partial removal of any infrastructure at sea. There's a lot of hesitation as to the exact size of the market as a result of the lack of transparency in certain regions as to the maturity of certain assets. But globally, it is estimated that between 2020 and 2023, $100 billion worth of assets will need to be decommissioned, which represents a 200% increase from the previous decade. The two most mature areas in the world are the Gulf of Mexico and obviously the North Sea, which represent more or less 50% of global assets, which are going to be decommissioned in the next decade. But there are obviously emerging markets, especially in Southeast Asia and in Latin America, which will sooner or later fall into the ranks. Decommissioning in a nutshell poses two main issues. The first is environmental. So there's the entire spectrum of questions which need to be posed with regards to the age of the infrastructures and their likelihood to create spills or other types of pollution. And then there's obviously the big one, which is the financial stakes. Ironically, decommissioning costs only represent 3% of the total value of an entire life cycle of a certain platform, with operational costs representing 24%, exploration costs 12%. But most of the time, operators didn't think about the decommissioning costs ahead of time. So now they're faced with these enormous costs, which they have to deal with very rapidly. And in the case of Europe, with a legal framework which imposes on them some form of removal. Knowing that the main cost actually isn't so much the removal of the jacket, so the part above the water, it's actually plugging the wells, which can be very complicated. So the plugging of the wells, which constitutes approximately 50% of the cost of decommissioning. And in the North Sea, where the seas are more, where the average depth is much deeper than in the Gulf of Mexico, it adds to the costs. And for one specific type of platform, with the exact same structure, exact same tonnage and size, the decommissioning costs can be very different because of the depth and the environment. So for example, one same structure, a study found that for a similar structure in the Gulf of Mexico, could be up to 30 times more expensive in the North Sea area. So the main challenge when you hear all these economic states is what is going to happen to the taxpayer, because many government reports have indicated that either through tax refunds or through different liability schemes, taxpayers could end up paying up to 60% of the total decommissioning costs. One clear example of this risk happened in Australia, where There's one of the major oil companies which transferred its assets to a small minor company who immediately after declared default, and the Australian government had to cover the entirety of the costs. So given that this trend of having more and more subsidiaries handle the decommissioning and the late life process of oil platforms and gas platforms, this will be a key financial and governance challenge to come. With regards to what happens when it comes to decommissioning, as Vasco said, the standard unofficial de facto rule is removal, partial or total. That's the standard, that's the gold standard. In the Gulf of Mexico, the United States has pioneered this in situ decommissioning. So it essentially revolves around partial removal of certain infrastructure and leaving the rest intact. And I believe Amber will come back on this point later on, essentially creating artificial reefs to preserve certain ecosystems which are very fragile or which can be protected under the scheme of maritime marine protected areas. Other uses include transforming into urban or touristic projects like the dive center in the Philippines. SpaceX bought 2 oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico for their launch pads. And in Europe, the European Union is starting to pioneer the reuse of oil rigs for renewable energy production. We'll probably come back to this later on because it poses a huge conflict in terms of competition over resources and especially the safety of the infrastructures.
Thank you, Nicholas. Very thorough as well. So now I turn you to Joshua. So Joshua is from Tasmania. It's 3 a.m. for him. He's still with us, and I really appreciate that because Joshua is the X Prize winner, and he developed this project to turn oil rigs into seaweed cultivation platform. So Joshua, for the audience, can you tell us, what you had in mind, why you wanted to get into that direction? And as Nicola mentioned, nobody has never mentioned that we could grow seaweed around an oil rig. So tell us more about your initial idea and your vision.
Yeah, thanks, Pierre. Yeah, so it's a bit early, but I'm very excited to be here to talk to you all today. So a little bit about the X Prize. So we're one of the winners, and they help innovative ideas get started. The founder of the X Prize likes to say, the day before something is truly a breakthrough, it's a crazy idea. And so I had this crazy idea after talking to oil and gas engineers in Norway, when they told me that when they have to do the engineering for how a platform is going to stay up during its life, they have to account for all the marine biodiversity and biomass that's going to accumulate on the legs of these platforms or on the concrete platform. And at the time, I was looking for a way to really get large-scale seaweed cultivation going. And as soon as I heard that, that possibility became clear. There's hundreds of platforms in the North Sea, and we can use these platforms for supply stations. They can provide energy, and as you might hear later, we can do the on-site refining of the seaweed, so we have less transport back to shore. When we're looking for these ocean solutions, we need to be looking how we can work together. And 45% of all economic activity in the ocean is from oil and gas. So how can we help them transition to a greener future? It's not just about the infrastructure, though. They've also been operating in these rough conditions for a long time. So there's that knowledge and IP around there as well. We can also help to transition staff across. So when we're talking about doing this in locations such as the North Sea, I think we need to remember that we're only at the very start of cultivating seaweed, and we don't know what's possible. So we can't simply go ahead on this, expanding out of nowhere with a lot of money. We need to take it very slow and be calculated, precise, strategic. However, we're still at the beginning. We don't really know what's possible. So, let's take some time and think about, where can we go with this? And, if the conditions permit it, could we see seaweed farming from space? It's crazy, but, we need to think about these things if we're going to address problems like food security and climate change.
Thank you, Joshua. And this is, the perfect timing, because it's, Seaweed Day, Seaweed Around the Clock. And this is the type of project that we are totally committed to. So we announced, the launch of a Seaweed Biomaterial Consortium. And hopefully at the end of this session, we'll be able to announce to our friends that we have already put, forward the first step, for building up this new consortium dedicated to oil rig. So let me turn, to the most Californian oil rig specialist, Amber, Blue Latitudes. Tell us more about the company and why you've been pioneer artificial reef with the decommissioned oil rigs. Were you a diver? What crossed your mind at the time where you imagined these solutions? Tell us more about this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Pierre. And it's a privilege to be here on this panel with all of you panelists. I am Amber Sparks, co-founder of Blue Latitudes. We are a nonprofit based in California that works on issues of conservation at the intersection of industry and the environment. And repurposing offshore platforms as artificial reefs or as seaweed cultivation sites is a great example of this. I am a marine scientist by training. I graduated from Scripps Institution of Oceanography down in San Diego, where my thesis was focused on the reality of repurposing California's platforms as reefs. What would that actually look like from an economic and ecological and social perspective? And what we found most interestingly is that California's platforms are some of the most productive ecosystems on the planet, more productive than coral reefs or than mangroves. These structures provide incredible habitats for marine life. And the secret really lies in the structure itself, ranging from seafloor to sea surface. These platforms provide a lot of real estate for marine life to grow, nooks and crannies. We see invertebrates that cover the entire structure, and then it attracts a multitude of marine life to form these really robust artificial reefs. An artificial reef is a man-made structure whose purpose is to mimic the natural environment. So the platforms in California mimic the natural rocky reef ecosystems we see in California. But the platforms in the Gulf of Mexico or in the North Sea or even in Australia would be mimicking the natural environments found in those specific ecosystems. So it's important to look at this decommissioning and the idea of repurposing these structures as reefs on a case-by-case basis, because they are going to be different in every ocean. But what we found are productive reef ecosystems on many of the structures that have been studied. It was mentioned that in the Gulf of Mexico, they are reefing platforms there pretty regularly. They have over 500 reefed platforms that are now part of Louisiana Department of Fish and Wildlife or Texas Park and Wildlife. And these structures provide important fisheries habitat in the Gulf. The US government even expanded their national marine sanctuary boundaries to incorporate one of these platforms into the Flower Garden Bank's National Marine Sanctuary. So there's lots of potential for repurposing these structures for not only ecosystem services and ecological benefits, but there could also be applications for mitigating climate change impacts or other important societal needs. So thank you for including me here today and looking forward to further discussion.
Thank you, Amber. Very interesting, the approach that you took. And so you were at Scripps, at the time where maybe Tony Emmett, and he was one of the first speakers, was still the director of Scripps. Small word, but we have, some strong network, and we want to make sure that we'll be successful with this project. So turning now to TO. TO is a key component. We've been talking about the potentialities of seaweed. We can grow seaweed, and we know the technology is almost ready for offshore cultivation, even in rough seas. So there might be a way to grow seaweed. But what will be the purpose of growing seaweed if we can't transform and do the biorefinery on site? So Theo, tell us more about who you are, what you've done with Goa Venture, and how amazing your technology could fit into this project, especially understanding that we have pipes that are connected directly to the mainland.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pierre, for this very nice introduction. My name is Theo Verleun. I'm the owner of Goa Ventures. Goa Ventures owns a seaweed bioprocessing technology based upon selective enzyme hydrolysis. Goa Ventures is a spin-out of two big multinationals called DSM and Eneco. They both are sustainable leaders in their respective field, in the food industry, respectively in the renewable energy industry. The growing world population will need more food and more energy, and the technology we developed is actually taking both out of each kilo of seaweed. So we take protein out of seaweed for human food purposes, and at the same time the remaining biomass is converted to biogas. This is on a very novel technology, which is taking about 3 to 4 days to do the full conversion and extraction, including the biogas production, which traditionally takes 20 to 90 days. The seaweed community is challenged by a very thin business case, if positive at all. Hence, we need to reduce costs, we need to increase volume, we need to automate, and we need to work with cascaded value extraction. And we want to serve the large needs of the global community. We can talk about very exclusive seaweed ingredients, but in this session, we talk about repurposing oil and gas rigs, and around those oil and gas rigs, we want to produce as much as possible seaweed. So we have this technology now at the edge of going commercial, and we process the seaweed fresh. That's another big advantage compared to most of the other industry leaders. What's the big advantage? Drying or freezing seaweed is either time-consuming or energy-intensive or environmental destructive, especially on the sustainability criteria. And on top of that, drying and freezing seaweed destroys, devastated the seaweed constituents like protein value. So if process seaweed fresh and do it in a short and quick turnaround and have two products taken out of the seaweed stream, now we're looking for a place where we can put the biorefinery. With Pierre and I met each other when we were talking about having mobile biorefineries, taking the refinery on a ship to the place where the seaweed is harvested and then convert to the required products. But at that conversation, Pierre and I touched upon the project of Joshua, that he just referred to, and then we started to dream away that can we perhaps repurpose an oil or gas rig and convert that into a seaweed biorefining location. And just to finish the question of Pierre, there are multiple reasons why we should consider this. First of all, we process the seaweed fresh, which means we can make it into a pumpable slurry and take it from the seaweed field onto the offshore rig. Secondary, we make quite a bit of biogas out of seaweed, and we can repurpose the gas lines that are connected between the rig and shore in order to bring the gas back to the traditional inlets into the gas grids available. So there are a couple of reasons why I like to be invited to Pierre's proposal, where Joshua and Pierre were talking about repurposing oil and gas rigs, because I see great opportunities for my technology and my company.
Not only from your technology, but you're a key asset, Theo. It's really likely that most of the people around you and me will join me and say, well, what you've done, so far, not only for the oil rig, project, is really stunning. And I like your passion, I like your enthusiasm, and it's not only, just declaration. And I see the results. So I hope that within no time we can convince, one of the key governments to fund this research, and we can all work, on this amazing project. So coming back to Nicholas, coming back to the government strategy, which is one of the main bottlenecks. In your report, you explained that Europe has established strict rules. Could you come back on the recommendation of the OSPAR Commission, and how likely the repurposing of the oil rigs will be complex, even for a new and with a great potential seaweed industry?
Yes, so as was mentioned, certain regions of the world have stronger environmental inclinations, and this is notably the case in California and in the North Sea. What essentially pushed the OSPAR Convention to become so environmentally radical, as we could say, was an incident in 1995 in which one of the oil majors had the intention of dumping an entire decommissioned platform into the North Sea. And after much lobbying, essentially, the oil major was forced to decommission the entirety of the platform, and stricter rules were enforced, in which essentially the entire removal of any offshore installation was made mandatory, except under certain very specific conditions, which include essentially being a huge platform and being technically very difficult. So with this framework, it becomes very difficult to envisage any form of reuse of the platforms, which is very ironic because the EU at the same time is launching the North Sea Energy Program, which is asking for investors and industrial groups to conceptualize the possibility of reusing offshore assets. So we have these two opposing forces, which aren't so far overlapping. And the main implications for the seaweed industry are the conflicting interests that there are with other industries. So notably environmental lobbies, which are of course against any reuse, existing decommissioning industries, which have now become very mature in the North Sea, which have become used to and who have built business models around the expected decommissioning industry, which lies ahead. So just as a heads up, in the North Sea, there are 470 platforms and 10,000 kilometers of pipelines to be decommissioned in the next 35 years. So there's a substantial amount of capital which has been invested towards the recycling of these platforms. And of course, there's the huge fishing lobby, which really looks forward to getting rid of these platforms to be able to trawl the bottom of the North Sea. So in terms of the seaweed space, the main objective will be to find a way to not only convince local authorities of the added value, both in terms of environment, but also in terms of economics of reusing these platforms, but also making sure that there isn't competition with other offshore uses, because of course, especially nowadays with the Ukrainian crisis and the whole decarbonization trend, there's a greater need for carbon-free sources of energy, which will very likely translate into growing assets such as offshore wind. And this competition is likely to have also an impact on the whole reusing of offshore assets. So both from a legal, technical, and governance perspective, it's kind of a gray area. And I believe that because seaweed has not so far been put forward as one of the options, there's obviously an opportunity, at least within the OSPAR framework, to push for change and innovation.
Thank you, Nicholas. So let me reorganize, my set of questions, and I'm going to jump immediately to Vasko before addressing the environmental issues. So Vasko, from an international legal point of view, who would be responsible and for what? And if we wish to mobilize the governments and still conduct, a pilot in the North Sea without, well, if we solve, the bottlenecks, what will be the next step forward, and how can we de-risk such a large and sensible project? Because so far, the public opinion is not even aware of what's happening.
Thank you very much, Pierre. You're absolutely right. I fully agree. There is a general lack of awareness by public opinion of not only of the current status of offshore installations, but also of their potential for a second life. I would say that the first legal bottleneck will always be determining the applicable law. Different offshore installations follow different regimes. So whether it's movable, immovable, and there are other constraints, namely the presence of cables connecting offshore installations, for example, to land or between other offshore installations. So there are a few tricky elements that have to be assessed. After doing that, and focusing on the legal perspective, de-risking would always be in terms of making an assessment of what are those legal regimes and how can you safeguard to make them more predictable at first, and second, that they will actually provide answers to some of our questions. And for this, you need good domestic legislation. You need good regulatory frameworks that determine what has to be done in order to repurpose, what kind of environmental impact assessments have to be carried out, and so on and so forth. So there are one offshore installation will necessarily rally different national entities that would have something to say about the repurposing of an offshore installation, and it's very important to do so. Then there are other elements that not focusing necessarily on the activity that you want to repurpose the infrastructure for, but for example, there are concerns, of course, in terms of the global approach that state will have to its own maritime space. So this activity has to be taken into consideration in a wider perspective of, and I'm referring specifically to marine special planning and the interaction between this activity and other activities happening offshore as well. So there are multi-layers of complexity. But on a positive note, I believe we have the expertise to provide a reasonable answer.
Thank you, Vasco, for this positive answer. So Amber, back to you, because we understand that California is taking, the strict route of environmental and repurposing the oil rigs and turn them, into natural reef. To get, the public opinion on our side, can you tell us more about your experience and to some extent how the natural reef has been, the place for regrowing the cap forest, and what is the process? So we would like, to better understand what are the different steps, of regrowing the natural forest using this natural reef, and how the public, opinion can be positively, impressed by what you have achieved, in some of your projects.
Sure. Yes. So the natural reefs. Are you talking about the reefs on the oil platforms, or which?
Yeah.
When you
Absolutely.
say the natural reefs regrown.
No, sorry,
okay.
My mistake. All reefs.
Yes. So because you have the artificial reefs on the oil platforms, which are different from your natural reefs that are the hard rocky substrate, what we find near shore. So offshore on the platforms, these structures do not have any kelp forests. They have scallops, anemones, mussels, what we call pioneering species that first establish on the galvanized steel. This material is highly attractive for different larvae, marine larvae in the water column, and they're attracted to a place to settle and develop. These platforms are also placed offshore, so they're far away from pollution, nearshore runoff, pollution, overfishing impacts that have degraded many of our natural reefs and natural ecosystems. And what we're finding is that fish species are moving offshore and making their permanent home on these platforms because they provide habitat and shelter away from pollution, as well as away from fishing pressure. So once you have the basis of your reef foundation that's formed through the different invertebrates, then the larger fish species and even the top predators like sharks or things like that start to come in and encompass the marine life and or the marine ecosystem that's formed on the oil platform. In terms of public perception and how people perceive these structures, most people, unless you're a diver or you've been fishing off one of these platforms, when you see these structures, they look like menacing giants out on the horizons. And most people see them as a negative thing, as a reminder of our society's reliance on oil and gas. They see them as potential oil spills. And so there's very little to help the public understand that below the surface, there could be so much more, that there's actually thriving marine life ecosystem there. So that's one of the things that our foundation really works on, is communicating to the public using visual media as well as important messaging and sort of disseminating the science into easily digestible and understandable concepts for the general public to change their perception of these offshore platforms. And through that understanding, we've seen, and that effort to educate, we've seen the public really respond positively to this idea of repurposing them as reefs.
And using the foundation, capital and image, do you have, famous people that have endorsed your action, and that people like, DiCaprio, that is very much, concerned by the reef and the coral reef? Do you think that these people will one day realize that there is a potential of changing, these oil rigs into natural reef, future natural reef, and how can we capitalize on their image, to accelerate the perception towards the public?
Oh, I think that getting buy-in from famous people is one of the best ways to accelerate an idea. If people are, they look up to these sort of figures, and so they see them as a source of information and even something to follow based off of what they think is important. So it's and repurposing an oil platform as an artificial reef has such a juxtaposition of industry and the environment. It can be a really interesting story, and there are many important players that have been enchanted by this and become supporters. One of the biggest ones in the ocean world is Dr. Sylvia Earle. She was our fiscal sponsor for 3 years right after graduate school and has publicly supported repurposing these structures as reefs. And she's worked in the Gulf of Mexico as well as spoken about some of the structures in California.
Yeah, Sylvia is a pioneer, in the field, and she has been very active, and we call her, her deepness. She was, the first woman to go down, in the Marian Trench. Joshua, so let's assume that we get one oil rig in the North Sea or in another place. If we want, to get traction and get, the general public on our side, would it be a possibility, to grow seaweed and also, to preserve some of the areas that we can have to showcase what could be, the natural regrowing and it's between you and Amber, but can we imagine you to have lines at the bottom of the rig where we can plant or seed, some kelp that will grow directly under the platform to even, attract more life and create a real biotop? And can we combine that with offshore cultivation?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Pierre, for the first trial. So, I think the important part is that we're communicating openly with the public from the beginning, and maybe this right here, right now, this is step one. And so for the first trial, we need to be very careful about the location we choose. The North Sea, in particular, because it's had such a history of trawling, it's a very shallow basin with an average depth of, I think, 90 meters. And because we've got so many rivers flowing into the North Sea, such as the Rhine that flows through France and Germany, and then the Netherlands, then we have a lot of nutrients going in there. And because seaweed thrives off nutrients, particularly nitrogen, we need to be looking for these areas, like where do we have too much eutrophication that's damaging this marine life, and then that the seaweed can really benefit from and thrive. So by doing a mapping study and pinpointing that location, we can, from growing seaweed, if it overlaps with also this decommissioning area, which it does in some locations, then we've got a really great place to try this, where we're going to have a net positive environmental outcome. And with this net environmental positive outcome, we can also use that to demonstrate to organizations like OSPAR that this is contributing positively to the North Sea ecosystem. For the first trial, there's the possibility of using the rig as one of the attachment points, as well as mooring to the seafloor. So this is good because growing in these deeper conditions can be quite challenging and costly. So starting small and gathering the data and really looking into this nutrient situation and how we can work with that to create the best outcome for the North Sea's future.
And in the first discussion that you had, in Tasmania or Australia, with the different key players, including oil and gas companies, is it well received as a concept, or what will be the perception of the oil and gas companies towards the repurposing projects using seaweed?
Yeah, so the oil and gas companies were surprisingly receptive down here. So began having discussions with many staff, and they're also giving some great feedback from the different departments about what risks they see. A big risk for doing a trial on a platform that is in a stasis period before that's when the well's plugged. There's no oil that's going to leak out, and it's just waiting to be removed by a heavy lifting vessel. It's the biggest barrier is actually going to be occupational health and safety barrier. So we need to think about these problems coming up.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
go ahead.
Yeah. However, Australia, it's an interesting place for a trial, but to be able to cultivate seaweed on a large scale offshore, we're going to need to use some other technology, such as upwelling systems. And this technology is still being developed, and it's up in the air whether these are positive to the environment. So for me, I have family from Europe as well. So the North Sea is my focus, just because of it's just this particular ecosystem that's going to be in some locations going to be very beneficial to seaweed, is what it seems like.
Excellent. And Brian, for us, and we've been in the last session talking about the upwelling for massive cultivation offshore. So if you can say, well, for you, it's going to be early morning, so it's not a problem. You're going to have a short night. Theo, the economics is really important, and we understand that if we want to convince the oil and gas industry to jump into our vision and project, we need to convince them that we can produce at scale. But with your biorefinery, the portable biorefinery, how can we scale up, and how many units do we need, if we want to produce massive quantity of natural gas?
Yeah, I was just, let's say, listening to the previous speakers when we were talking about public opinion. Here also, I think the numbers of a bioprocessing facility can contribute to the public's opinion, because if we consider Joshua's recommendation to focus at the North Sea, which is an area of about 500,000 square kilometers, and we convert 50 square kilometers to seaweed farm, we roughly produce 1 million metric tons wet weight of seaweed. This 1 million metric tons of seaweed is sufficient to produce for about 500,000 of people their annual need of protein, and about 100,000 households of energy. So with those kind of numbers, and just a 0.001% of the North Sea space is already feeding a large amount of people with essential protein as a food ingredient and fueling 100,000 households. So with the energy demand, especially now with the crisis in Eastern Europe, we have a huge opportunity. And in earlier conversations, we were talking about the sharing facilities in the North Sea. So not repurposing, but sharing with the offshore wind industry. The offshore wind space that is allocated in the North Sea is in the range of about 50,000 square kilometers. There will be 25,000 windmills, and that space alone, with the numbers I just mentioned on protein yield and biogas yield, if we would consider a third or a quarter of the offshore wind space being farming area for seaweeds, then we have no need to import soy from Brazil in order to feed the European food and feed requirements. And we have a plenty amount of energy, although it will be on several locations. Pierre, back to your question. If 1 million metric ton wet weight processed per year, that means 12 months a year, which is not likely going to happen in the North Sea, because we likely will have 5 or 6 months, 7 months harvesting period, and the other months it's too cold to grow seaweeds. So we also need to do the right calculations in comparison or in balance with the nutrient availability in the North Sea, as Joshua just referred to, because the North Sea is a shallow, sandy floor. So repurposing rigs like Amber is doing, I am not aware that we have that much slugs and crustaceans and whatever in the North Sea, other than we have now a few artificial rocks in the North Sea where they try to combine lobster and crab farming with seaweed farming, but that's still near shore activities. So from a utilization point of view, I guess we have perfect messages to bring to the community if we get this project up and running and get the numbers together. And like we said, the Caribbean Gulf region, the removed rigs and the statues that are still there have first all been closed wells. And I understood from Nicholas' information that 50 to 60% of the costs is closing the well. So we should also be careful in promising big savings, because the well still needs to be closed, and before we can repurpose it and disclaim, with the help of Vasco, all the liabilities on the risk that the well starts to leak again or whatever.
So I'm going to use this tribune, we were fortunate because we have Mary Goujon. She is the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs and Iceland in Scotland. And most of, the most important part of the future decommissioned oil rigs are part of, the England domain, including Scotland. So Mary, if you're listening to this session, we want to talk to you, and we want to bring you a very disruptive innovation that will help you, to reconsider the repurposing of oil rigs. And saying that, I'm going to pass you back, the floor, and I'm going to go with Amber first. So Amber, what would be the key message you want to send to our audience, and what would be your recommendation?
I would say that my key message would be to consider and continue to pursue alternative decommissioning strategies, whether that be repurposing a structure as a reef or finding a way to upcycle the material for aquaculture or alternative energy generation. With that existing infrastructure offshore, there's a world of possibilities, and it is up to us to determine what that future will be.
Thank you very much. Nicholas, you're on mute.
The key message, which is less inspiring but very rigorous, is just more data. There's a huge bias in the literature that exists on decommissioning because we focus on existing platforms which have not been removed, but there are very little studies on the impacts of removing. What happens when you actually do remove a platform? What are the impacts on the ecosystem and marine life? So regardless of how we choose to go forward with decommissioning, more information is required on understanding the full impact of how decommissioning processes impact both environments, but also local economies.
Thank you very much. Theo, what would be your last word before we get into action?
Yeah, there's never a last word, Pierre. But the key message, I guess, it's technically possible. I strongly believe that we have a topic to present to the asset owners. The team that is emerging here at this event of the Seaweed Around the Clock is a perfect start to get the facts together in order to assess the possibilities and the risks and the costs. However, we also need the asset owners to participate in such a conversation. So I'm looking forward to, if there's anybody in the audience, to make themselves known and join forces ASAP.
This is also a message to my friend from BP. He will recognize himself. It's time, to talk, and I'm going to send you more information about our, white paper, and hopefully we can talk and start, the project with you guys in Scotland. Now back, to Vaško. What would be your message, Vaško?
Well, I think being almost the last, I benefit from fantastic messages that have been put forward already on the table. And I would just highlight a very important aspect that has been mentioned both by Amber and Theo, that is the fact that we must look at the ocean not only as a very important resource, but also as our key to the future as a species. And that is very important. And therefore, we must think out of the box. There are solutions from technical, legal, economic, and financial perspective, and we must do this with earnest. And thank you, Pierre, for putting us together and making sure that we keep this ball moving. Thank you.
You know me, you can count on me. I'm never giving up on any of these cool projects. So the last word will be, to the creator of the idea, Joshua. One day you woke up, you had this idea. So now it's time, to make it real. So what will be your final word, for this session, and what will be the first step, forward?
Well, I think fundamentally, the biggest problem humanity faces right now is actually a collaboration problem. And what we've been talking about today is this very interesting opportunity where we can collaborate in a new way. We can think about new ways of structuring these organizations to work together, all grounded in having sensors in the water informing our decision making. And with this new kind of collaboration, then we can move forward to make these big, ambitious but needed projects happen, and happen fast. So if you're in the audience today or you're following up after, and if this resonates with you, then have a think, where do I fit into this? Is there some way that I can contribute? And if that's you, then please reach out. We'd love to hear from you. So thanks for the session, Pierre, and everyone. It's been great.
Thank you, Joshua. And this is just the beginning. And I invite you, to connect with the panelists. The contacts information will be accessible for you online on the platform. During 1 month, you have a full access to their email, and you can, reach out to them, connect, organize your own video meeting. The video will be live tomorrow, but after it's going to be by text and email. I also invite you, to visit the virtual expo, the lounge. And if you have any question, contact me. I will relay the information. And just again, if you want to be part of this collaborative project, please, tell us as soon as possible. Thank you very much. Thank you for being with us, at this very early time. Thank you, Amber, for having your coffee with us. And thank you, Theo, for finishing your tea right now. And Nicholas and Vashko, I wish you a good evening. And I look forward, to finish the show in less than 6 hours. You take care. Bye-bye.